welcome everyone to the very last Tuesday Times Roundtable of the academic year. So don't come next week. There won't be food, there won't be me, there won't be anything going on. I appreciate all of you that have been loyal attendees, and even those that have been here before I show up every week. We appreciate your participation in this. Before I introduce today's moderator, I want to draw your attention to two flyers that should still have some left up at the front there. One is something our moderator Jackie brought about the UNICEF club here at FIU. So Jackie's representing UNICEF, and there is a campus club, and there's some flyers up by the sign-in sheet if you missed them. And there's also this flyer for being able to go to PDQ. What is this, Shanti? Thursday? 14th? Okay, so for Thursday. So to give some context of what this is, because it just says supporting Go Global, you've probably heard me, if you've been around the past few weeks, talk about the bike drive that we're doing for recently arrived refugee families in Miami. And so we actually have gotten some bikes. There have been 2 bikes that have actually been brought and dropped off at our bike shop. There are several other bikes that we're aware of people being interested in donating, and have to try to help them get them to campus. And we've raised some money on our GoFundMe page. So this thing is working to some degree. And our contact at the Refugee Resettlement Agency was so excited to come pick up one of the bikes already on campus. And so that's awesome. So actually, Ashanti here was the student who set up to help the bike drive, because in addition to actually getting physical bikes to raise some money that we can use to buy bikes, she went to PDQ and set up the fundraiser. So this Thursday from 6 to 9, anything you buy at PDQ, a portion of the proceeds will be directly sent to CWS, which is the agency that gets the bikes, so that they can buy bikes. You do have to bring this flyer, so make sure if you took one, you keep it with you and bring it there. And PDQ is awesome. I really like it. So good.
Thanks.
So good. All right, best sauce is the best ranch sauce. I've never tasted. I didn't think ranch sauce could be something that's like there is some ranch sauce better than other ranch sauce. I just thought ranch is ranch, but man, they have really good ranch. And that is my ranch rant for the day. So today's moderator, Jackie Rojas, currently serves as the Global Citizenship Fellow for the U.S. Fund for UNICEF here in Miami. In her role, she acts as a grassroots spokesperson who aims to bring together networks of volunteers, faith-based community schools, universities, advocates, elected leaders, and others in their work towards educating, advocating for, and fundraising for UNICEF's work in supporting children and families abroad. UNICEF, if you're not familiar, by the way, is the arm of the United Nations. That's the United Nations Children's Fund. Through her work, Jackie has continued to develop a deeper understanding of issues facing the world's children and plans to continue taking action in future roles. She graduated from Florida State University with her BA in International Affairs and BS in Political Science, and was the recipient of the Bourne Scholarship to Mozambique in 2014. She's been a great partner for FIU and FIU Global Learning, and has been to roundtables before and done other stuff with us. So I look forward to today's presentation. Jackie, turning it to you.
All right, thank you so much, Eric. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you all today. As Eric has mentioned, my name is Jackie, and I work for the U.S. Fund for UNICEF here in Miami. The U.S. Fund for UNICEF is a national committee, one of 36 around the world, that supports UNICEF's efforts financially and through raising awareness and bringing more people together to take action for the organization. It's an organization that's been around for nearly 70 years, so it's been pretty active and probably one of the most effective in supporting UNICEF's work abroad. So today, I chose to speak about an issue that I think is pretty relevant to what's going on in our global community in terms of the refugee and migrant crisis. But this presentation is actually going to talk about the effect that those emergency situations, so things like conflict and things like tsunamis and just those natural disasters, the effect that that has on children, and particularly the effect that it has in education. Because we don't think about it a lot. We think about people in displaced persons camp and people crossing crossing the borders to get to Greece and to get to other parts of the EU, but there are still those people who remain in the Middle East and North Africa who are constantly in the line of fire and are dealing with situations we can't really think about. And education is one of the things that's hurt most by these conflicts. So with that, my goal for you all today is hopefully that you all develop a better understanding of how children's education is affected by emergency situations, what UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, is doing to address these issues, and ways that you all here in the United States can take actions through the U.S. Fund for UNICEF. So my first question for you all is, what do you define as an emergency? What would you say is an emergency?
A crisis of some sort.
Okay, a crisis of some sort. Anyone else?
Something that needs to be fixed right away.
Okay, something that needs immediate attention. Perfect. Awesome. So this is what UNICEF defines as an emergency, a situation that threatens the lives and well-being of a population and requires extraordinary action to ensure the survival, care, and protection of people, of those communities that have been affected. So you guys are correct, and it requires extraordinary action. It requires immediate response. It's a crisis situation, and something that people aren't expecting, correct? So when there's an emergency, all of these different needs that you didn't really realize were there or were present before become ever more present. And then there's something called a complex emergency, which is what we would define as the Syrian crisis right now. So a complex emergency is a humanitarian crisis in a country, region, or society where there's a considerable breakdown or lack of authority due to some internal or external conflict, and it's directly affecting those populations that live within that area. So these are the two types of emergencies that UNICEF primarily works in. There's the basic emergencies, and I say basic because they're not complex, but there's emergencies and there's complex emergencies, and so both require that extraordinary action, and complex emergencies just require something a lot more in terms of support. They require a lot more interagency coordination and coordination with other international organizations, and so it's not just something that one organization can handle. So understanding what emergencies are, emergencies can range from what they are. So there's natural disasters and there's man-made conflicts. Natural disasters are cyclones, tsunamis, earthquakes. We've had plenty of examples of those in the past few years. And then man-made conflicts. So anything like the internal conflict in the DRC or something like the Syrian crisis. All of these are man-made conflicts. Similar to, or pretty much fitting that definition of what a complex emergency is. UNICEF operates and addresses 3 different levels of conflict. So there's level 1, which is basically a type of emergency that a country office of UNICEF can handle on its own. There's also level 2 emergencies, which require a little bit more support on a regional basis and also from UNICEF headquarters. And then there's something called a level 3 emergency, which is the most dire emergency. And that requires support from so many different organizations. So that's exactly what we're dealing with when we talk about the Syrian crisis. That's a level 3 emergency that is requiring not just work from UNICEF, but requiring work and the support of so many different international organizations and local organizations that are in that region. So with that, it's important to note that internationally, so our communities are facing increasingly complex situations. So it's not just, this isn't a humanitarian emergency. It's so much more than that now, given some of the growing issues in our world. So climate change is one thing that is significantly impacting emergency situations. So we're seeing a lot more climate-related emergency situations. And then there's also things such as urbanization. So how do you address an emergency situation in a very, very urbanized area? There are issues with infrastructure that sometimes that organizations aren't prepared to deal with and make it all that more difficult to address. Unfortunately, in these emergency situations, women and children are placed at a significant risk. 60 to 80% of the affected populations during an emergency are women and children. So that's a majority of that the majority of these populations being affected are women and children. And I'm going to specifically speak about the Middle East and North Africa because that's where, so UNICEF had a report a few months ago called Education Under Fire, which is what this presentation was inspired for, and it specifically focused on education in the Middle East and North Africa. The article that was selected for this kind of gives a brief overview as well of what that study says. But ultimately, this region is right now just happens to be a great example of what has to be done in order to address the needs of children and families in times of emergencies. So when we're talking about the Middle East and North Africa, we're talking about the region. We're talking about a region that spans from Morocco to Iran. So a lot of different countries are in there. Other ones include Sudan, Egypt, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon. It's a pretty big region, and I would list all of the countries, but there's a lot. So this report that I'm specifically talking about, though, it covers 9 countries. So that's Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, and the state of Palestine. Those are the 9 regions that this report specifically focuses on. But within this region, there are about 418 million people, and almost 40% of that population is under the age of 18. So in this region that is heavily affected by conflict and by emergency and humanitarian crises, almost close to a majority of that population are children, which is huge. And when we think about how children are significantly impacted by these situations. Conflict in the Middle East and North Africa has directly and indirectly impacted several countries, and this conflict has unfortunately forced millions and millions of people to flee their homes and countries, and so we see more people on the run now than we did during World War II. We see millions of people in internally displaced camps. We see refugees going to Europe, and all of these issues coming because of conflict and because of that emergency situation in the region. And then another issue that kind of makes addressing these emergency situations all the more difficult is that there are significant disparities between a lot of the countries. So one example is Saudi Arabia, which is one of the wealthiest countries in the Middle East and North Africa. It borders Yemen, which happens to be one of the poorest and most conflict-ridden. So we see those disparities existing, and it's hard to address those issues given how this region operates. And then there are other disparities that exist, so things like income inequality, gender inequalities, and geographical inequalities that kind of perpetuate this, the instability and insecurity of the region and hurt children all the more. Okay, so I've mentioned this, but millions of children are at risk during humanitarian emergencies. So what are the effects of these humanitarian emergencies? And some of them are, children are forced to flee their homes. There are food shortages that come from things like climate change. Children are more vulnerable to violence and diseases, and more vulnerable to abuse. And there's also a lot of threats to their education. So conflict is definitely impactful in the lives of children, and not in a great way. And I've talked a little bit more about conflict and how it impacts children, but I mentioned as well that climate change is definitely something that causes, and climate-related issues also cause a lot of concern in terms of emergencies and humanitarian crises. So in the last 10 years, we've seen some of the largest disasters on record, and climate is responsible for about 75% of all disasters. So this is really important because there's almost been 1.8 billion people affected by these emergencies caused by natural disasters. We're seeing a lot of issues in terms of food shortages particularly, and what impact that has on the nutrition of children. So in countries like Yemen, where there's currently a food shortage, we're seeing a lot more children becoming malnourished, and that's really detrimental to their well-being and their growth. In places like Sudan as well, in the Sahel, where there's been droughts and that is also causing emergency situations, leading to children being, in terms of food shortages, and leading to children being more malnourished. So floods are also a problem. Floods, because they bring a lot of unnecessary water into these communities that aren't often able to support that amount of water due to their infrastructure. There are also issues with standing water. So things like standing water bring more diseases like malaria that are waterborne, and especially when there's unclean drinking water, that can be very detrimental in the lives of children. So that was really loud, sorry. So climate and natural disasters, definitely huge impact in terms of emergencies. But we're going to go back to conflict. I just wanted to highlight a little bit more about how climate impacts emergency situations. So this is an impact. I remember seeing this number for the first time and thinking, wow, 1 in 9 children around the world live in conflict zones. There's a lot of people in this room, and if we counted out 1 in every 9 people, that's still a huge number of people who would be living in conflict. And I think that's not a situation that we would wish for anyone. And unfortunately, the children in these situations aren't ever really responsible for the places that they're living in. So with that, we have 250 million children around the world that are living in conflict-affected areas. 1 in 8 babies born in 2015 were born in conflict zones. So every 2 seconds, a child took its first breath in a conflict area, in a zone that was affected by conflict, which I think is crazy. 1 in 8 children born in conflict. 1 in 4 children in conflict zones are out of school. So there are approximately 13 plus million children that are not in school because of conflict. So this definitely has a huge impact on the ability of children to learn and their ability to continue developing. And then we see that there are 30 million child refugees worldwide, which I've mentioned before is the biggest number that we've seen since World War II. So beyond the violence and instability, I've hinted at this kind of, but there are a lot of issues with malnutrition, human trafficking, access to clean, safe drinking water, and education that impact these children's lives. And because they're more vulnerable in these situations due to issues of instability and insecurity within their countries, there aren't that many systems that protect children, and that's not really a priority for a lot of governments in these conflict situations. So it's very important to realize that these children are facing extreme situations that we probably have never seen here in the United States. And when we think of what's going on in terms of the migrant and refugee crisis, it's important to remember that children are also in this situation and they're being impacted heavily by conflict. So this is another number that really shocks me, but children in armed conflict are twice as likely to die of preventable causes before they reach the age of 5 in comparison to other countries. And that's not actually directly from conflict. That is from preventable causes such as malaria or such as pneumonia or violence that comes from human trafficking and and a lack of other social protection services. So these are all things that are causing children to lose their lives and to be hurt because they can't be provided for during these situations. And then these are other really great numbers to see and just think about the impact that these situations have on children. But I'm not going to read them all because you all can read. But they are really important to note. And more than half of it, this relates to the educational piece that I was speaking on. But countries in armed conflict situations, they account for half of the children who aren't in school globally. So there are about 58 million children around the world who are currently not in primary school. Half of those are in these conflict-affected regions. Okay, education, finally. So education is an area of UNICEF's work and an area in particular that I love to speak about. When I lived in Mozambique, I worked with a nonprofit over there that specifically worked to address the literacy needs of the capital city's communities, and especially marginalized populations within the capital city. They worked to they worked to really just create a culture of reading. And so from there, I really developed my passion for understanding educational issues and language acquisition in terms of that educational development. So this is why I really chose to talk about this, but also because education has been significantly impacted because of conflict situations. So teachers and students in these situations are finding themselves in the line of fire. So more than 8,000 schools have been destroyed due to conflict. Those are 8,000 schools that can no longer be used by students because they are being used for something else, or there's so much damage to them that they cannot function. That's a huge number of schools. Imagine if 8,000 schools were destroyed here in the United States. Yeah, so we wouldn't let that happen here, right? So that's just a number that, again, really speaks to the impact that these emergency situations are having on the lives of children. And then there's this issue with teachers. So teachers are also a concern during emergency situations because teachers have their own stories to tell as well. So you have teachers that have their own stories of loss and their own stories of destruction, but somehow they're still required to teach and they're still going out and putting themselves on the line to teach these students. But unfortunately, more than 5,000 teachers in this region have had to leave their positions. And there's over 500 counselors that have also had to leave because they're fleeing violence or other reasons. But that puts a lot of strain on those teachers who remain in those countries and in these conflict-affected areas. So imagine going from a staff of 10 teachers to a staff of 2 teachers teaching like hundreds and hundreds of students. That wears teachers down. It puts an excessive burden on their ability to teach. And there's also this issue that there aren't resources to really train these educators, and that affects their ability and their quality of teaching as well. So not only is it affecting these teachers, but it's affecting the children's ability to pick up the information and to get that quality education that all children have a right to. Cool. So Syria is a country that has particularly been affected by this situation. So this is a conflict that's been going on for 5 years. That 5th year anniversary was recently celebrated, and by celebrated I don't mean something happy, but it was just something that the world commemorated, because 5 years of a conflict is a very big deal. There are children in Syria who have never gone to a school. So that lack of education is critical for their development. If you think about all of the skills that you learn in primary school. So you learn things such as sharing. You learn things about how peace is good. You learn to work with others from different communities. You even just learn tangible writing skills and things that are very important to overall development of an individual. So not having access to that education is detrimental. And unfortunately for Syria, like I said, 5 years, some children have never seen the inside of a classroom. But what's worse is that with these 5 years, resources have been stretched very, very thinly. So there really aren't the resources to address the needs of these schools. Syria is an interesting case, though, because they're still having school. Children can still learn the curriculum and they can still take their exams. But those schools that are still available and still open are often overcrowded and do not bring students into the classroom. Teachers, again, are probably strained with their load, and it's very hard to teach a large class when you're just one. Then there are issues that children like this girl, Amina, who had to travel hours to get to her exam. That's not a safe situation for children, and imagine having to walk all that distance or having to ride a bus by yourself all that distance and the different vulnerabilities that come from that, whether it be some sort of abuse or some sort of violence that can come from that situation. So these 5 years in Syria have been pretty difficult on children, and it's something that a lot of us don't really realize as we go on thinking about this conflict that's happening there. And in other parts of Syria, there are concerns with the changing So different groups who rule different areas of the country, they're actually changing curriculum within the country. So in some of the northern parts of the country, curriculum has been changed, and some subjects have been removed from their educational or from the curriculum, and there's more regulations on girls. So not only are we saying that it's more difficult for students to go to school, but that other people are making it more difficult for children to learn. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about UNICEF's role in these situations. So maybe you guys can tell me your thoughts, but what do you guys think an organization like UNICEF or other organizations, what are their responsibilities in these situations, and how can we best address, let's say, education in emergencies?
Resources. We could take those whether other countries that don't have.
Yeah.
As much as
Perfect. So fundraising. Did you guys know that UNICEF can provide 40 days worth of clean water for a child in an emergency situation for just $1? All you need is $1, and UNICEF can provide a child with clean water for 40 days. So fundraising. Fundraising is a huge part of this. There are so many gaps in the funding for these international crises and emergency situations. And it's difficult, and education is actually one of the areas that receives kind of the least amount of funding when it comes to emergency situations. Okay, so we do have a responsibility as global citizens to be engaged in this world. We can fundraise. That's one way that we can help. So UNICEF does a lot of those things. So UNICEF does believe that it has a responsibility to address the needs of children and ensure that their well-being is protected and that they are protected as children and are able to develop into adults. So emergency situations is actually UNICEF's specialty. So I don't know how many of you know anything about the history of UNICEF, but it was actually created out of an emergency. So it was created at the end of World War II to respond to the needs of children during World War II and after the war. And so since then, it's been operating in response to emergencies, but it's also added a few different program areas. So they currently work in 7 different program areas. Some of them include nutrition, health, HIV/AIDS, social inclusion, child protection, and a few others. But those are some of the different program areas that this organization works in. But emergencies is kind of their specialty, and it's something that, like I said, they've been doing for nearly 70 years. So they have the formula down to something that they can be very effective in their role as an actor that addresses humanitarian crises. So for UNICEF, one of the biggest concerns during an emergency situation is to get supplies to this region. And a lot of that time we're dealing with conflicts, right? Or maybe roads have been damaged because of a natural disaster. But UNICEF has been they're actually able to get supplies to an emergency within 72 hours of being called upon. So UNICEF actually doesn't operate in countries it's not invited to work in. So UNICEF worked in the United States once during Hurricane Katrina, but that's because the government of the U.S. asked UNICEF to come in. It won't just go in randomly into other countries and act. But supplies is one of the biggest things. And then there's health, so addressing the immediate health needs. So if there's standing water, for example, making sure that children are getting bed nets, or making sure that those who seem to have symptoms of malaria or some other disease, that they're immediately treated. Water, sanitation, and hygiene, which they use the acronym WASH. So ensuring that in these emergency situations, there's immediate access to clean, safe drinking water, or providing water purification tablets that families can use to purify their water. Because water just happens to be one of the waterborne issues. Waterborne diseases cause a lot of mortality, unfortunately. Nutrition, so especially in cases of food shortages, making sure that children who are at risk to become severely acutely malnourished, that they're protected and being provided with the right nutrients to gain their strength back. Education, pretty much everything that I've been talking about. And then protection, so working with local systems and local governments to ensure that there are policies and programs in place to protect children. And then ensuring that cash transfers are available so that the money that needs to get to UNICEF is available. So that's how they work in humanitarian action. But in response to the educational needs of these children in emergencies, UNICEF has actually scaled up their response, and they're working with a lot of other international organizations and also local organizations on the ground within the region to really address the needs of these children. So the No Lost Generation Initiative is this whole project behind the children of Syria and hoping that we don't lose a generation of children to this conflict and that they're able to be educated despite what's going on there. So with other international organizations, they've really been working to ensure that there's a safe area for children to learn. There are safe spaces for children to learn within Syria and surrounding countries. They've helped form school clubs so that there's some sort of at least informal education that children can receive to catch up for missed schooling. There's something called they have back to learning campaigns, which are basically, they work with other providers to ensure that children are, again, getting these safe spaces to learn, but helping them get those safe spaces to learn by providing things such as desks and chairs and other necessary materials to work in school. Then there's something called self-learning programs, which I think is one of probably the most innovative ways that they're addressing this. But UNICEF and other, the UNRWA and other education providers have actually come together to form curriculum that students can learn from on their own. So instead of sending them off to school or letting them take that dangerous journey, they can actually learn from home. And so this is something that I thought was really fascinating and definitely a unique way in which disrupted education can be remedied. And then I didn't write this, and then expanding learning spaces. So basically, more than 8,000 schools have been destroyed. How can you expand those learning spaces, or how can you make those spaces better again to ensure that children can actually learn? So it's definitely a big need, but UNICEF and a lot of local organizations in the region are working to address those learning spaces needs. And then I didn't write this one up there, but there's something called e-learning, which they're testing it out. And again, it's kind of another innovative way that the organization and other international organizations are trying to address this learning need. But by developing e-learning, they're hoping that it kind of supplements and adds to that self-learning process. So there is that concern, though, that there are places without electricity and without internet. So this is still something that's being tested. But in Sudan and Lebanon, they've had particular success with e-learning.
Self-learning does that mean self-learn? What is self-learning? Is that like they're delivered like like paper material?
Yeah, it's more paper materials based. So there's actually like a school in a box kit that UNICEF sends out, which is paper based and has materials enough for 40 students. So providing those types of materials enable that self-learning. And so if there is a teacher and there is an open space like a community leader's house or something like that, that can facilitate in that self-learning process. Okay. And so using those different initiatives and programs, UNICEF has a few goals when it comes to helping these children. So I've said that 13 million children have been driven from their classrooms because of conflict. And the educational prospects of this generation are a great concern. So by working with all of these different organizations and by putting children's rights first and their right to learn, UNICEF has a few goals from their programs. So the first is to reduce the number of children that are outside of school. The second is to support partners and national systems to be actually able to address these needs on their own. And so in emergency situations, really building back up those governments or those systems so that in times of an emergency, or if that ever happens again in the future, they can adequately address that need. And then recognition and accreditation. So I mentioned that we have some self-learning, we have other programs, some sort of informal education that's going on, but it's important that UNICEF has to advocate for the recognition and accreditation of these forms of education. So that's a big priority on their list. And then increased advocacy to stop attacks on schools and educational facilities. So one of UNICEF's unique roles is that they actually do negotiate ceasefires, which I think is fascinating. So they're pretty important in terms of advocacy and trying to actually stop those attacks. And then lastly, just prioritizing funding and meeting that funding gap. which is probably one of the more challenging ones to accomplish. So, I did it again, sorry. Okay, so we're going to move on to the U.S. Fund for UNICEF now. So I've mentioned all of this in my communication and in my introduction, but this is a national committee. There's 36 around the world that work to support everything UNICEF is doing from their home location. So the U.S. Fund for UNICEF happens to be the oldest national committee and one that provides over 20% of UNICEF's annual budget, which is huge. So I mentioned that they have a $5 billion budget. Almost 20% of that comes from the U.S. Fund for UNICEF. So definitely a very impactful organization. But within the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, we have a few different ways that we actually take action here in the United States and hopefully inspire other community members and other people within the country to take action as well. Because it's not enough that just one person takes action. No, it needs to be, it has to be a movement in order for anything to really change. So one of the ways that the U.S. Fund kind of facilitates this process is through UNICEF clubs. FIU actually has a UNICEF club. Their president is here, so if you have any questions about what the UNICEF club does, you can talk to her as well. But the FIU UNICEF club is actually the best one in the country. They recently had a summit and were voted as the best UNICEF club in the nation, which is a huge deal. So they're super impactful in the work that they do. They do service learning. They do other service projects with local community members. They raise awareness for UNICEF's work, and they help advocate for policies that will significantly impact children's lives. So if you're interested about the UNICEF clubs, you can talk to me, or you can talk to the president here. Raise your hand, Carla. My name is Carla Franco, but you can come talk to me. And I'm sorry. Yeah. So you can come talk to me, and I can give you more details about them as well. And another way that you all can take action here in the United States is through advocacy. So I don't know how many of you know what advocacy is or how that process goes, but there's advocacy, so things such as raising awareness on social media, and then there's advocacy, which is actually going to your representative and senators' offices and talking to them about important legislation that you want to see happen. So if you're a citizen of the United States, you have that right to go and see your representative and to go and see your senator and talk to them about your concerns. So with the way that UNICEF does advocacy, of course, we're advocating for policies that support children's rights. And so we actually have a congressional action team here in Miami, which is a team that we come together on a monthly basis to talk about ways to take action and take on advocacy and actually speaking to our representatives and senators to affect change. So a really cool group if you're interested in that whole advocacy, lobbying process. Definitely great experience as well. So this is whenever it loads. Yay. Okay, so this is something that you guys can visit on the UNICEF USA website, but it's actually a letter that we have already designed that you can write to President Obama asking him to support children caught in the refugee and migrant crisis. It's such a simple thing that you can do. It takes 5 seconds for you to just sign your name and say, President Obama, I want you to be concerned about this, if that's something you want to be concerned about and want President Obama to be concerned about. Okay, and then lastly, this is a unique opportunity for young professionals and people who are kind of wanting to find like that young professionals network or a unique way to use their time and skills beyond what you do in terms of college volunteering. But we have a group called UNICEF Next Generation, and it was recently formed, but it's across it's in all different cities across the United States, but basically it's a group for people aged 21 to 40 and who share a commitment to UNICEF and seeing the future and putting children first in their futures. And so basically through their financial resources and through their education and advocacy as well, they host different events and really come together on a national level to impact the lives of children. So this is a really fascinating group. If you want more information, you can also talk to me about that. Yeah?
Why is there a cap at 40 years old?
Because it's like that. It's supposed to be that young professionals age group. It's geared more for that age group. But there are plenty of opportunities for people who are above the age of 40 to continue on in their involvement within the U.S. Fund for UNICEF. So that can look like taking on additional leadership roles in the volunteering division, or potentially even joining like a UNICEF board or a UNICEF USA board here in the country. Yeah?
I know you guys do more work in like Syria, but is there other like countries you guys would like feel to do more, like low income, middle income countries where people are getting malnourished and stuff like that?
Yeah, so UNICEF actually works in over 190 countries and territories. So it's not just Syria. They're working in so many different areas. So in terms of like, let's say Latin America and the Caribbean right now, like their focus is really on addressing like the needs of the Zika virus, right? And so kind of raising awareness within those communities for them to be able to prevent that disease from spreading any more within their communities. So they definitely work in all different countries of the world. The Sahel region, for example, one of the poorest areas, unfortunately, in the continent of Africa, but it's definitely an area that UNICEF is working in. I know just from my experience in Mozambique. So if you look at Mozambique's GDP, it's one of the poorest countries in the world, but they work a lot with children in terms of there's a lot of discrimination against albino children in Mozambique, so addressing their needs as well. And ensuring that they're protected. So yeah, over 190 countries and territories and different program areas for each country.
Commenty question and then question.
Yeah.
There were quite a few statistics about the number of children out of school.
Mm-hmm.
There was some reference to gender disparity in there, but I imagine that most of the people who are out of school are probably the girls, and so I wonder if there are other things that have to be done other than like providing access to school, because it's also about like when parents and families are deciding like which children are going to take the risk for, there's like some like choice making there too. But I don't know if you have stats or not, but I imagine like of the 1 in 4 kids who aren't in school, probably 3 of those 4 are probably girls or something, from what it seems like. It's my commenty question. But then question. Who are the people, when you see UNICEF people in these countries putting up, health tents and education tents, are there like full-time UNICEF employees that they just go from country to country? Or are there like doctors and things that UNICEF recruits to do it for this specific country for this specific month? Or some combination of those things?
Okay, so I'll address the first commenting question. So I mentioned that around the world, so globally, and not just in the Middle East and North Africa, but there are currently 58 million children missing out on their primary education, and over half of those are girls. Unfortunately, so there's still a lot of gender inequality issues that persist globally. I mean, we see them here in the United States, so it's only natural that they occur globally as well. But the way that, gender equality happens to actually be one of the themes of UNICEF's strategic plan for the next few years. It's definitely a priority in a few different program areas, but they're actually working to scale up their response to gender equality issues during times of emergencies. So I think once the strategic plan ends, and it ends in 2017, we'll probably see more of a report of how UNICEF was able to address gender inequality during times of emergencies. And so to address your second question, which I don't know if everyone heard it, but he was basically asking, so when you hear of UNICEF working in the field, who's working in the field, who does UNICEF recruit to come in and work on the field? So UNICEF has country offices in all of these different countries that it works in, and it also has regional offices. So within these country and regional offices, most of the staff within those countries are actually from that country. So it's not just random people from developed nations going into these countries and like trying to tell them what to do. No, they actually staff people from within that country to work in their offices. That's part of the sustainability issues that UNICEF wants to address, and ensuring that whatever they're doing is as sustainable as it can be. And so when it comes to things like, so a lot of the work that UNICEF does, it actually works with local organizations. So when we talk about nutrition issues, they find local health organizations, maybe a local health nonprofit within that country, to actually help facilitate that process. So it's not just UNICEF staffers doing it on their own. They do have people within each office that's responsible for overseeing health or education or emergency response needs. But through their work with partners, which is really how the work gets done, they're better able to address those needs. But then there are situations, and during emergencies especially, so there is something called the UN Volunteer Program, and this is something that you can register for depending on your skills and needs. But whenever there is a time of an emergency or something like that, it could be that if you're registered, you might be called upon to go serve. But it's not something that UNICEF just sends out volunteers or anything to go and work. They want to make sure that they're being as effective in their work, so they're going to probably get those people who are more experienced in that country to address those needs.
How does the UNICEF respond to friendly fire from coalition forces? For example, Gaza 2014, Yemen 2015, and Afghanistan 2019.
So how does it respond to that friendly fire?
Yeah, like when, for example, some of the schools that UNICEF has in conflict zones get bombed, how do they respond and how do they actually retaliate against whoever bombed them? It could be an ally or it could be a foe.
So UNICEF is really it's like bipartisan. They don't take sides, and so their goal is not to really make a political statement or address those political issues. Their role is primarily to address children's needs. So let's say that there is an organization, that there is a school that's been bombed, right? So UNICEF will not ask its allies or its other partner organizations to particularly do something. Rather, the way that UNICEF field workers and their staff workers go about doing things is they try to meet with both parties and facilitate a ceasefire so that that bombing or that violence stops in that area. It's not always as successful as they want it to be, but there have been cases of success. So El Salvador, for example, during their civil war, UNICEF wanted to do an immunization campaign, but you had two groups who were murdering people like on end, and so they actually got both sides to stop firing for a day, and they were able to do their immunization campaign. So that's really their priority when it comes to seeing some sort of violence like that. It's just really getting it to stop by working with the parties themselves. Yeah.
Is the program that you mentioned, the school in a box, is that something new that they're trying to get done, or has it been in place for a while now?
It's actually been in place for a while. They've had it. They've been having these. So I know it's been out for a while. When I went to the UN a few months ago, they actually had one of the first original school in a box kits that was sent out in like the 50s. So it's been around for a while, and probably one of the most effective ways to actually address that educational need during an emergency, because it does bring it brings materials enough for 40 students and a teacher, and it brings like chalkboard paint, and you can like paint the top and make it a chalkboard, and then they have like notebooks and pencils. They have like a tarp, so if you're in an open area, you can kind of have a covered space as well. So it's a really you can look up a little bit more if you type in school in a box on Google, but they'll give you you can see like all of the different materials that are in it, and I can't tell you the exact cost right now, but I don't even think it's all that expensive for UNICEF to provide a material like that. So definitely a great resource and something that's been around for a while.
Does Saudi Arabia provide a lot of funding for UNICEF by any chance?
I can't tell you about Saudi Arabia specifically. I can look it up for you though and figure out what percentage or what contribution they make if you would like, and I can get back to you on that. Okay, so come up and give me your email and I'll take it down.
Services within the Division of Information Technology at Florida International University.